And if you want to kick us off, I think we can get started. We'll be recording this and um, folks can catch up as we go.
Great. Do you mind if I steal some of your thunder as far as how we oriented to
Yeah,
you being the
you
speaker? All right.
you're like Thor. You get your own thunder.
Forward.
So
Welcome everyone. Today we've got a really interesting topic: understanding production capacity in the U.S. book market. This has been on our agenda for a long time. We've had some difficulty finding a speaker for it. So finally, Brian kind of threw himself in the way of the bus, or like maybe I can come up with a better metaphor, but he jumped in and rescued us and put together an extremely thoughtful kind of combination deck tutorial discussion guide that we're going to be going through today. And I'm seeing this as the opportunity to really kick off some additional cooperation with BMI and in the industry to really help publishers and manufacturers work together to understand what the challenges are around capacity. So I think with that, Brian, maybe what I'll do is I'll just let you take it over.
thanks, and I appreciate the introduction. And I agree with you that this is an attempt on my part to um, frame the conversation a little bit more. We haven't really had a clear sense of how we want to go ahead. So this is a starting point. And it's very much in the spirit of what we try to do with Lunch and Learn, which is put an idea out there and then hear clearly from the people who are attending the call today on what we might either do differently or better with it. So you'll see this slide both at this point and at the end, and it kind of summarizes the thinking that the takeaways that I want everybody to have for today. The first piece is that we need to give an acknowledgement to the spec challenge. That there are a lot of different types of books and measuring capacity simply by talking about lead time or some other aspect of it without taking into account book complexity and production capacity is probably not going to work really well for us. There are also aspects of volatility in the supply chain, as well as a lot of changes in how demand works. What we're going to propose today is essentially a way to try and measure the capacity of equipment, materials, labor, technology, and demand all across the board. And if you jump down to the third paragraph here, it's a message you've heard in both Lunch and Learns like this one, as well as in other programming that we've done with BISG, that we need better forecasting. We need to a certain extent, consolidation around specifications. We need, in particular, stronger supplier relationships because to trade information about capacity is also to a little bit to expose, some proprietary or what might be currently confidential information. So we need to do that in a trusted setting. And then we also have to have a better sense of what the impact of technologies like print on demand, digital printing are on overall capacity. The good news is those are things that we've been touching on regularly over the last few years in this series and through our supply chain committee, which Ken chairs. But it is really this is an opportunity to bring a number of those different initiatives together to try and look at capacity. The other thing I'd say before I move on from this is that we don't have to measure capacity. The reason it's coming up right now is that there is both because of tariffs or the threat of tariffs, as well as just generally an evolution in how people think about global supply chains. At least some consideration of repatriating work that may be currently done outside the United States market. So having a better sense of capacity within the U.S. market is going to get it stands a shot at getting us closer to actually making that a reality. So the first piece of it, when we want to try and figure out what capacity means in book publishing, is we have to look end to end. So it's pre-press, it's printing, which could be offset, could be digital, but it also includes binding and finishing. Sometimes we look only at presses. Obviously, each stage has a different capacity limit, a throughput that collectively determines overall throughput. And if binders run slower than presses, which is often the case, multiple binders may give you greater capacity, but if they're not available at the time that you need them, that doesn't really help you. The other thing is that the interconnectedness of the production plan. I think it's second nature to people who do production. But when we're trying to talk about capacity, it's not just the speed of any one component, but the overall synchronized capability. This is something that when we've done, like Matt Cannell has done things on, um, fostering a relationship, a productive strategic relationship with a manufacturing partner. And this is a notion that he comes back to regularly. And then the third thing is that product mix makes a huge difference. Trade paperbacks printed in tens or hundreds of thousands are going to have a different effective capacity than a short run of full color case bound art books. Again, that's second nature, but it also means that any average of average doesn't necessarily help you figure out what the overall capacity is. So we have a couple slides in this and we will make this presentation available in the follow-up to everybody who's registered. But a couple of ways to look at spec family dilemmas. The first piece is variety. I mean, there are many trim sizes. Everybody knows that there are multiple paper grades, colors, binding types, finishing options. So this makes standard capacity measurement a challenge. The other thing is that the different specifications, depending on the shop, can require unique machine setups. It's in many cases they're going to affect run speeds, particularly if you're working with a printer that's not optimized for a particular trim size or basis weight. Sometimes the material handling can become a challenge. All of these things affect capacity. It's also worth breaking out nominal versus effective. So there's some press is sold with a nominal capacity, how many sheets per hour, et cetera. But in effect, particularly with respect to make readies, maintenance time, et cetera, there's really an effective capacity that's going to be lower because it has to take all those other things into account. And then the last piece is that the job mix is changing. I mean, the books that are successful this year are not necessarily the books that are going to be successful next year. Some markets, if you specialize in textbook publishing, the formats have changed remarkably over the last few years. Finishing in particular is a challenge. So it's not enough to just simply pick a spec mix at one point and then carry it forward forever. We have to kind of find ways to adjust to it. This kind of comes at it from a different perspective, but talking in specific about what the value might be of simplifying specifications or standardizing them. When it comes to things like trim sizes, you've got obviously greater cost efficiency. Paper grade, weight, and opacity do affect run speed. And sometimes they require special handling. There are papers, I mean, the easiest one is Bible stock, where the presses that we would want to use to print on it are largely not available in the US market. So understanding what that implies and how we might respond to it are critical considerations. Coloration plays a significant role. It's a lot easier to do monographs than it is to do art books. And the setups and the workflow speeds and capacities are all at play there. And then the last piece is finishing, which can be a really big deal for different types of books. So, short runs generally give are given over to digital printing for agility, but the finishing requirements that you might have can often limit those when the special treatment's needed, and it's not something that is kind of set up for in a print on demand or digital shop. It's not like this is a new topic. There are industry reports and data sources. Probably the AAP snapshot comes out monthly, but it's really focusing on revenue and not operational capacity or lead times. BMI has done some really good work on aggregated capacity utilization, lead times, and some labor trend data. and it provides snapshots, but it has limited detail on the impact of specification changes or changes in the mix. Various printers have, this is one of the things that Matt Cannell from VersaPress has talked about in the past. They have different plant or printer level measures of things like availability, performance, quality at the plant level. It it's hard to standardize and aggregate those measures across diverse printers because the specs vary, the data definitions vary, and so do the equipment that they're using. So the takeaway for what we have right now is not that it's bad or not useful, it's just the opposite, but they tend to lack spec mix detail. Plant KPIs are really good for internal measurement and internal optimization, but they're tough to make work across an entire industry. It's not a uniform definition. And so this makes it hard to understand not necessarily what each plant is doing, but what the overall capacity of the US market might be. So what we had in mind, and this is something that is very much a work in process, is a three-step effort to develop a capacity framework. First one is establishing a measure of baseline physical capacity, and that starts with inventory. So you see in the grayed out toward the bottom, measures might be the current inventory, theoretical max output. You could make job baskets or spec families that are archetypal for a plant, and then some adjusted baseline capacity that really reflects the effective capacity. The second is to figure out a way to capture changes in specifications over time. So at this level, you're trying to figure out how is the universe of books that we might print changing, and what might we be expected to do in the coming month, the coming 6 months, the coming year. That also includes digital versus offset, the opportunity for using automation, and the impact of complexity in binding and finishing. And the last piece is to look at supply chain constraints. So paper market health, labor conditions play a big role. If you don't have paper that you need for a job, obviously you're going to lose capacity to at least put that job through. The lead time is going to be significantly impacted by that. But there are other things too about with respect to labor that we've touched upon in conversations. BMI has done much better work on it, as you'd expect, but it's a real challenge for the industry, and we need to be able to take that into effect. So in that case, you're looking at what's going on with the paper market, what's going on with labor, and figuring out how to adjust capacity to reflect those realities. The kinds of data that we might need come from manufacturers, they come from publishers. And what we've listed here is, at least at a high level, the kinds of things we think we would want. The equipment, production hours, average setup times, run lengths, waste rates, key production bottlenecks. And you'll see in both 01 and 02 here, the annotation that this is sensitive data. We have to recognize that asking somebody to expose their operation in this way, we need to protect the data. That's point 3 that I'll get to in a moment. From publishers, you're also looking at forecasted demand by spec category. We have metadata for this generally at least 6 months ahead of time. In the trade space, lead times on education can actually be longer. But it's typically not the case that publishers forecast it. This is one of the things we've been trying to work on through the supply chain committee. But things like actual orders versus forecasts to assess accuracy, lead time, experiences by job type, and there's an impact for things like paper shortages or capacity issues. This is somewhat sensitive data. I don't think it's quite the same as asking a printer for how their operations work, but it does require us to think about taking metadata and creating spec families out of it. Consistent data definitions do currently elude us. anyone who's ever tried to figure out what pub date means in book publishing knows how resistant quite a few of the publishers who would have to define it are to coming up with a common definition. But that's also true for uh, the kinds of things that we've identified in 1 and 2. The other thing is we have to figure out a way to do this confidential. It's probably in some ways a data space of some sort that allows for information to be collected either anonymously or at least aggregated to protect information that would otherwise be sensitive for, at a plant or a vendor level, and find ways to build trust among participants. And the last piece is you need organizations like BMI, BISG probably, to standardize the data, collect and analyze it, and share the findings. And it's got to be done in a robust way. I think if we're looking only at our own membership, which is what BISG has done in the past, it doesn't really give us a true sense of the U.S. capacity. And I think if we did have a good sense of what the market looks like, it's going to be a kind of, particularly if we can identify demand for publishers, from publishers rather, for printing and manufacturing capacity, and then capacity among manufacturers to effectively create a better market in the US or in North America. So within this, this is a level of detail that we can come back to, but I don't want to go through it. But the kinds of things that we're thinking about at the top level to come up with some sort of measure for weighted capacity utilization that is a function of an understanding what we're actually asking the manufacturing sector to do and what share of its relative capacity it takes up. A few times by job complexity would be really interesting and useful. I think that it might teach us that if we really want to move a book through quickly, that certain specifications can be avoided. Adjusting for lead time on that regard would be really useful. There's an interesting notion of measuring or monitoring print quality. I would probably extend that even to print and bind quality to say that, in essence, if we're seeing more errors, more problems with books, maybe it's a sign that we're at or beyond the effective capacity that the supply chain can support. And then from there, develop an overall cycle time by spec family. So there's a lot that would need to be done in this regard and a lot more conversations around it. But this is at least a starting point for some of the KPIs we might develop. In a similar way, we can look at supply chain health with things like forecast accuracy. Gary Jones, who Ken brought into the conversation supply chain a couple of years ago, probably closer to 3 years ago now. But Gary Jones from River Rock has done a really good job of, just talking about it's not enough to just make a forecast, that you have to actually look at how you did and you learn from that. And that measurement is really important to it. Things like on-time delivery rates from printers. This could be marked as sensitive thing. We're not looking to evaluate printers. We're looking to understand the capacity of the system. So if the percentage of orders that are delivered by an agreed upon date is declining, it could indicate that the supply chain is struggling to deliver on the capacity that we think it has. So that's a learning opportunity. But it's not an opportunity to evaluate the plant, right, except by the manufacturer themselves, but rather to better understand what the impact of specifications and requirements are on the supply chain as a whole. Lead time by spec category, we've kicked around a little bit. Printer capacity reservation rate. Here, if there are printers that will sell, excuse me for just a minute. Will reserve capacity with some of their clients. If those reservations rates go up, it could signal tightening capacity and the need for better and more consistent forecasts. And then measuring what's going on with paper could also be a measure of the overall industry health. I wanted to come back to this before I wrap up in a moment with some suggestions for strategy for publishers by going back to this notion that we've talked about before and will continue to talk about, which is the evolving role of manufacturers as strategic partners in the supply chain and not as vendors. We really want to see manufacturers continue to transition to serve as strategic partners. And a number of manufacturers have said that they want this too, but they also struggle sometimes that when capacity becomes more available, that their publisher partners act more like we kind of return to the vendor relationship. And that's a conversation we'll continue to have both individually and with the industry. Transparency, though, in operations and capacity planning is both important to make this work, and I think it is valued. Flexibility is as well. It requires investment in technology. If you want greater operational flexibility, efficiency, or capacity, it manufacturers have to spend money, and that kind of has to be measured against expectations of demand. So being better at having those conversations, I think, is important to the industry. It's not that big an industry, and it's important that we treat it as to make it as treat it in a way that makes it as efficient as possible where we can. And I think ultimately the data sharing that I'm talking about provides publishers with better visibility into capacity and production status, not just at the vendor level, but also at the industry, and gives greater confidence to repatriate work if the capacity is there. And then last piece here is just what should publishers be working on? Top of the list is improved demand forecasting and communication. I promise you I didn't put that in just to make Ken Brooks happy, but it does make Ken Brooks happy. The second is to evaluate standard book specifications. This is not the notion that one book size fits all, but maybe there are industry standard trim sizes, common paper grades, and predictable binding methods where it's possible to both improve capacity because you're reducing setup time and reducing cost or improving cost effectiveness. The thing I've just finished summarizing, we think it's important for publishers to manage their supplier relationships strategically. Deep collaborative partnerships are the basis for being able to share data openly and in an environment of trust. But that's not going to occur if it's a vendor relationship. We do think that technology can play a role here. Print on demand and digital printing technologies are there now. But we also think that there are potential applications of things like AI that would help improve supply chain efficiency, forecasting, and the like. And then the last piece is it's important for publishers to support an initiative like this. If BMI, BISG are going to collect and share comprehensive capacity data, it has to be valued. I don't think that ultimately that this is something that works at the level of a survey. It has to be more data sharing than surveys. But at the very least, when we start, it's going to be surveys, and to actively participate in those efforts is important. So I'm going to close the slide I opened with and just kind of reemphasize the three key points that I wanted to leave you with today. The first is that specs, volatility, and dynamic demand play a significant role in how we define capacity. The second is that we need diverse measures of capacity, starting with equipment and materials, but also looking at labor, technology, and the overall demand mix, and have it be robust enough so that if the specification mix changes, which it absolutely will, that we can adjust for it. And the third piece is that publishers have a significant role here to play in working as good partners in forecasting better, optimizing their own specs, and building strong relationships. So I think that this is a complex thing to solve, but I think it is solvable. And hopefully I've put enough on the table that we can kick it around a little bit and see what else we can come up with. So I'll stop sharing. If anyone has an interest in coming back to a slide, we can always go back.
So Brian, I was tossing in some questions that occurred to me as you were progressing through the slides. And going back to the first and the last slide, if you look ahead 5 years, um, where do you see the biggest leverage? Press scheduling, spec optimization, demand forecasting? And do you see AI being able to make a dent in any of those?
Yeah, I would say among those three, and you can push back if you feel like there's a different answer. I think the demand forecasting is the opportunity. It's not that specs aren't important, but I think first, if we start with specs, we run the risk of losing a publisher audience. I do think it's important to understand the impact of specifications on capacity, and I think that would foster a different conversation.
Yeah.
But that's going to take time to get to. I absolutely think AI could play a role. As you know, I mean, we have an AI working group, and I've struggled with it on at times, not so much lately, but I'm always looking for the supply chain application. And there's a lot of things that are publisher specific. So creating an audiobook um, or creating marketing copy, which are kind of the single segment applications. What I haven't seen to date is that killer app for supply chain. I think it's coming. It's probably more machine learning than AI, but I think we need to find it and figure out ways to apply it so that we become as efficient as we can be without changing the nature of the book business.
To kind of go off on that tangent just for a moment, I've been thinking about this as well. And certainly you can think of like supply chain objectives and the organization and the processes to achieve that and improving those with data and machine learning and all the rest. I actually am experimenting now with another thing that happens all the time in operational management is you keep getting these different issues or risks that pop up. And so using AI to scan the environment for these things, present them, and then kind of come up with a plan for how you're going to deal with them, either as they materialize or as they might materialize. That might actually be the way to use generative AI in supply chain to its greatest
Yeah,
capacity.
I mean, you have a both a comfort level with AI and an approach I think that people tend to miss. You know, and I've talked about this offline a couple of occasions, that it's important to iterate. Um, you know, that it's if you just go in and you say, here's my demand forecast, you know, tell me where it's wrong, you're not going to get a particularly good answer. But if you ask it much more specific questions in series, um, and you essentially use it as a almost like a as if you had a production director standing next to you and just say, well, how would you handle this? And it comes up with a different answer. You remember that I started my career in magazine production, and a lot of times I would just ask the what ifs because I was working on weekly magazines. There was always something that might go wrong, and we would just ask ourselves, well, what if we had to change something on Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock? You know, how much content would have already been printed? How many copies would have already gone out the door, et cetera? And it kind of gives you a comfort level to know when the time comes that you have to make a decision at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, that you know pretty closely where you are. AI can be helpful in that same regard.
So back to the original question, like press scheduling, spec optimization, demand forecasting. I think you're right in that press scheduling is likely pretty well handled by the manufacturers already. They've
Right?
probably done this as part of optimizing their flow. Spec optimization, we've all lived through those firefights, and you're right, that's going to be a long one, and it's going to be hard to convince somebody. So I think demand forecasting is probably the opportunity. But when I think of that, I think of different ways of measuring the forecast. It's like bias. Are you high or low? The accuracy, which you mentioned of MAPE, or the stability. And in some of my discussions with printers, what they really care about is that the forecast is stable, that what you forecast out doesn't wildly jump around so that they can actually plan how they're going to respond to it. Any thoughts about
Right.
that?
Well, it's funny because um, I've worked in a printing plant. Maybe I'm the only director of a trade association book publishing that's worked in a printing plant. Um, and I would have to absolutely agree with my colleagues that knowing what's coming gives you tremendous flexibility, knowing what you're going to do with it. When somebody changes specifications at the last minute, it can throw wrenches into works that you don't even think about. Um, and um, so I do think predictability is a significant opportunity. I think the way that we talked about in book publishing, though, is the predictability may not be at the level of a title, but rather at the level of a list or an aggregate, a house, or perhaps even a cross section of publishers. But I think at the very least, we look at a list and think, okay, well, some books are going when we go back to the deck and talking about the importance of understanding how far off you were in a forecast. Um, it it might be that on average you're always low. Well, then that's going to create problems for a printer. But if you can say, look, we're always budgeting low, and we think we're going to wind up needing more, knowing that effectively creates not certainty, but at least that direction. If on average you're high and low, but to roughly the same amounts, if as long as you can move other capacity into or out of a work plan, you've got an upside. And I think that ultimately that's part of the selling part of changing specifications. If the argument is that changing specifications either makes it possible to get a job done more quickly or with less expense because you're not allocating time and money to make readies and setups, then that's something that a publisher can consider and make an informed decision on. So
When you talked about the maybe at the level of the list, where I thought you were going to go was at the spec family. So
yeah, that's
maybe
actually a better way to think about it.
because that's the capacity that you're going to be tying up, and presumably the ups and downs would balance, and you could move things in and out, right?
Yeah, and I think in general at the capacity that any one publisher is looking for, if it's predictable, then by whatever measure, spec family or the list as a whole, then the problem starts to go away. The I think it is important, and it's possible to look at metadata. We typically don't convey print run data in metadata. I mean, that's conveyed separately to the manufacturing partner that publisher chooses. But we could marry that and look at here's the spec family, here's the total printing, um, and the data structures need to be built, but I think it's highly doable.
Yeah, I think some of the XBits, though it's hasn't doesn't really get referred to very much, kind of in the past, had some of that kind of information that might be useful.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, XBits never really got past a single vendor implementation as a standard, and um, we'd be happy to revisit it. There's Block 8 within um, Onyx that is capable of handling both audio and print on demand specifications. So they're typically we're not conveying production data
Right.
in metadata, so we'd have to figure out a way to make that work. XBits is not a bad solution.
The I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. So for publishers that run both long run paperbacks and short run full color titles, what would you say is the single most effective lever for balancing capacity across those extremes?
I mean, well, one thing that we haven't talked about is that horses for courses, that there are printers that are really good at a particular type of work. Most printers are not good at everything. And even if you get a larger printer that is capable of doing everything, they still have plants that are affected. So I think if I understand your question fully, I'd say you got to start with and this is actually part of the recommendation as well, is understand what plants are good at. And then optimize for that work. Don't expect them to be able to do everything, but expect them to be able to do the things that they can do really well. So I would say that if you had a list that broke down, your spec families broke down into things that were essentially mass market paperback and then four color um, coffee table books, you're not printing that in the same plant.
That's
Your
right.
measures of capacity have to be different, and to understand that clearly and to place the work where it most clearly belongs, which may not be always the best price, but rather the place where the work can be done reliably.
Yeah. So the answer of that is there actually is no single effective lever, or the single effective lever is to treat them separately as separate spec families and don't try to combine them.
Yeah, I mean, if you find a plant that can do everything well, um, don't tell
Right.
anyone.
That's right. We often we have talked a little bit about this standardizing designs. Have you seen any data or anything that gives a clue as to what might be effective, an effective reason that publishers and editors would listen to for standardizing design?
No, I mean, I don't think we have the mechanisms to collect that data right now. And part of what I would do is in a project like this, is start to collect the data so that you know the throughput. If you think about the measures for industry, the queue time by job complexity as an example, you have the ability to start to look at whether or not you can run your machines significantly faster or more reliably by having standard specifications. If you don't, then you can't lower your prices. The costs will be roughly the same. But if you have greater throughput, then the allocation, at least of the capital that you've invested, can be amortized over a larger number of units, which lowers your overall costs, or improves your profitability if you choose to go down that route.
Well, what's interesting here is this kind of gets to the whole nominal versus effective capacity discussion.
Right.
That um, by tracking this and making decisions about what to place on what presses, you can actually calculate that nominal to effective capacity um, percent reduction. And I guess the idea is the longer the runs, the more you can keep the machines utilized, the more you can balance capacity across your entire facility, the closer your effective capacity is going to be to nominal.
Right. And I think that that's a trade-off too. I mean, if I think about like in the on-demand space, there are um, plant setups that include variable knife trimmers where you can change the trim on the fly. They operate at a certain speed that is, I think, predictably lower than if a setup was for a single trim size. The trade-off is that you can put multiple types of books in there. Getting a better understanding of what the trade-off is there, and both in terms of throughput and quality, is something that's kind of missing for us. So I think if we spend more time thinking about what is it that we want to achieve, so we want to get so many books out the door in a given day. And if we had a common trim or a standard set of families, and we could optimize a plant for that, is that better than having a variety of different printers handling it with variable knife trimmers? I don't know the answer. I'd
Well,
like to.
yeah, it's complex. It's complex, and you're actually making me think of another thing, like the variable knife trimmers and offline capabilities and on demand. you could use those to kind of knock out the peaks that would enable you to boost the effective capacity of the main facilities if you had a way
Yeah.
to
If you're
offload.
not if you're not interrupting a longer run to get a shorter run done because you have a short run fill in capacity, that potentially improves your overall capacity for the market. The thing is, you want the market to make these decisions. You don't want BMI or BISG, particularly not BISG, making the decisions about what print runs go where. Um, but I think that getting the data allows us to make at least recommendations and better understand what the impact is.
Now, this one's a bit of a curveball, but given the paper market swings, how far out do you think publishers should be locking in paper buys to protect their capacity without overbuying or over speculating? See, curveball.
Is that your question?
Yeah.
Wow. You're tougher than I've always been on the other side of this. So I don't think I realized how hard these questions can get. Um, I'm trying to think about how I would think about a paper buying decision. Um, Part of it is governed by market. The price piece is an individual company. It's a cost of capital question. So buying a lot of paper up front for lower unit cost may make sense if you have predictable demand and you can figure out what is paying for that 2 years ahead of time costs you. And it may be that you don't have to lay the cash out. Maybe you're buying capacity at a future date, um, and paying for it when it's delivered. But that really is at the level of a company. I do think, though, that the thing that people have to keep in mind about paper is that it does have a shelf life, and particularly in the environments that um, not all plants are climate controlled, and not all warehouses are climate controlled as well. And I think that there's a practical limit to putting paper in a less controlled environment that would suggest that unless there's a really significant concern about losing access and availability, that I would keep it under 6 months, because otherwise you're going to be wasting a lot more paper.
Um, I'm also thinking about the approach there, and you could think about your paper buy as a kind of capacity as well. So you could
Yeah.
plan it out the same way as you plan out your spec family, and then do the forecasting, lock in the agreements. And I think when it comes right down to it, having the paper is more important than the specific unit price of the paper, although we'll of course negotiate with that. So the real key is just make sure that you got the capacity. And if it looks like something's going to happen, then get an alternate source lined up pretty fast.
I don't see Matt Cannell on the call today, but he used an example of that in a talk that he gave. I feel like it was late last year. We'll look up the recording and find it for you. But one of the things that they try to do at Versa is they look at uh, their plan, their print plan, and for the clients where they're buying the paper, um, they try to pick it in like 4-week increments, and then they're looking for a minimum level of stock on the floor. They go
Yeah.
through a process where they accept rolls and then sheet them, because their presses are all sheet, and so there's an additional step that requires a slightly earlier delivery, I think. But it is possible to look at demand forecasting. That comes back, though, to the observation you made, and I think in your first question about looking for predictability, and consistency and predictability over time from publishers. That you don't want to go out and buy a lot of paper and then find out you're not going to use any of it. Um, that they generally, because they're buying relatively short windows of paper, you can catch up more or less quickly. But it's still the case that predictability becomes a really important component of how you manage your overall
Back,
paper purchasing plan.
back to forecasting again.
Always.
Um, so OEE and TEP were
Right.
two kind of new concepts for me in this presentation. So presumably they vary wildly across plants.
Yeah, and equipment.
How should someone think about, like, how should a publisher think about these kinds of metrics and how to use them?
Two fronts. One is that I don't think that those are proposals that would necessarily become the basis for a standard reporting on capacity, but rather that they're examples of how each plant is already thinking about efficiency and effectiveness um, on its own. And so there may be something that we can build on in that, but we have to come up with something that is at least for spec families consistent across spinning plants. Um, it's not enough, and this is what's in the prepared materials. It's not enough to just simply aggregate the current capacity assessments. Somebody might say, "Well, I'm at 93%," and based upon their measure of total effective capacity, and then somebody else has 74, but they mean the same things. It just that they're
Yeah.
measuring the baselines are different, and so I think we need to have conversations based with each with the cross section of different printers to better understand that. And there are some folks representing manufacturing partners on the call. They may have a perspective on that as well.
Um, Again, like, well, not again, but digital capacity versus conventional or offset capacity.
Yeah.
In that flexibility score, do you view them as substitutes or complements?
Um, well, between the two, I'd say complements. I don't think of digital capacity as uh, competing with traditional offset or other uh, formats. It's how do you get the work done?
Yeah. So
So
it's
it's
you're really
part of the
coming back.
overall.
Yeah, you're coming back to the trim family or the family, and then it can be either digital or it can be done offset. But when you
Yeah,
really
if you the capacity in digital is going to be um, the throughput's going to be less, um, but the capacity could be greater if the number of presses that are available. If Ashley Gordon is successful at converting the entire world to print on demand.
um, so for the publishers in the room, what do you think is the kind of the must share data point that unlocks the greatest industry benefit with the least competitive risk?
Data point from printers in your
Uh,
or just data
from
point for.
Yeah, publisher that publishers should share with printers.
Oh, well, I think it's overall demand by family, by spec family.
Yeah.
How many copies of, if it's a 6x9 equivalent, how many copies of 6x9, of 8x10, of oversized, and the spec family also obviously has to take into account binding method, and any finishing options. But if we can come up with a coherent list of a manageable number of spec families and just say, here's what we expect to require in 2026 as a starting point, I think that the entire U.S. printing industry would be very interested in those numbers,
Yeah.
and that I think I'm not speaking obviously for BMI in this regard, but I do in casual conversations I've had with Matt Baer, who's my counterpart at BMI, and with members of the organization. And they're very interested in understanding what the relative share of work that's not produced in the United States is. They would like to be able to compete for it where it makes sense. Some some jobs may not ever make sense, but at the very least to know what's the baseline, how much U.S. production or North American production exists in a given year, by what type, and then how much of it is available to be done in the United States. So,
I could easily see just running through a few of these, like 5x8 soft cover, single color interior is clearly a family. 6x9 hardcover and soft cover, again single color, maybe 7x9, and then 8x10 or 8.5x11 with 4 color, what have you. I think we could probably come up with, I don't know, between 10 and 20 families that make up 90% of the volume.
yeah, and there are offline steps that are not necessarily offline, but secondary steps like hardcover, some soft covers as well as offline. In the education space, you have different bindings, including loose leaf and spiral bound and others um, that are obviously rate limiting step for different types of books.
Seriously,
So,
right? Yeah.
uh,
So how would a publisher use this weighted capacity metric? Forecast pruning, title reprioritization, something else? And like, in what condition are publisher systems able to really use that kind of information?
well, I think the question becomes, is it a partnership or is it just a vendor? If you're dealing directly with a set of manufacturing partners and you know what their capacity is, that may be good enough for you, and you don't need to know the industry number. I think our approach here is driven by something else, which is that the industry is very small relative to almost all other industries. So you know, 40 billion US at retail value. And I think that um, the well-being of the paper and printing components of our industries are at risk. We've seen a lot of consolidation. There are pricing pressures, and the capacity to produce in the U.S. market is potentially at risk. Or potentially consolidated in a smaller number of larger companies that are still not necessarily big enough to invest heavily in the things that the U.S. market might need. So the way I approach this is the same way that we're trying to do book publishing next. I see this as potentially a component of it, that we need to identify the components of the supply chain that are getting in the way of um, maintaining what we need to be an effective North American publishing industry, and trying to build a conversation around where are we going, what's our capacity look like, and is it worth investing in the U.S. market? I think the answer hopefully is yes, it's worth investing in the U.S. market, but we have to show that the capacity could be moved if it's currently being done elsewhere, and B, that folks are willing to make the long-term investment in manufacturing capacity where it's needed to deliver on that. That's the long play. I don't think it's not necessarily a benefit for any one publisher. It's a benefit for the industry, and ultimately, then that gives us the capacity we need to do what we want to do in the U.S. or in the North American space.
Well, as any good speaker, you just gave a great wrap up pitch just before the end of the end of the period here. Yeah, I had some other questions, but we don't really have time for that. If anyone else has any questions they'd like to drop in or to come off mute and ask, let me invite you to do that. And if not, I think we probably ought to wrap with
Yeah,
a pretty successful presentation.
we'll talk about this. We have the supply chain meeting in 2 weeks from now, and we're gonna put this on the agenda just to at least share it with the full committee, and we'll continue to talk about it. Matt Bear and I had a brief email exchange when this was on the drawing board, and we'll continue to talk about it with BMI. it really does have a home. They've already been doing the reporting in this area. The question is, what can we do to create an industry rather than just a manufacturing push on this? And I think that's an area where BISG is strong.
Sounds good. Sounds very good. Thank you for
Thanks for the
this
time.
second wrap up. Great seeing everyone. Have a good day.